Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, today we are going to uncover a truth that has been hidden in plain sight for far too long. The Bible, the most widely read book in history, is filled with powerful, influential black figures whose stories have been ignored, distorted, or forgotten. But today, we set the record straight. Here are 7 shocking facts about black people in the Bible that you may have never heard before. Fact number 1. The first named people in the Bible were black. When we open the book of Genesis, we find the land of Cush, an ancient African civilization, mentioned right from the beginning. The Cushites were descendants of Noah's son Ham, and Cush itself is the biblical name for Ethiopia. This means Africa is central to human history from the start. Fact number 2. Moses married a black woman. Yes, you heard that right. In Numbers 12:1, we learn that Moses married an Ethiopian woman, and it caused such an uproar that even his own family criticized him. But God himself stepped in, defending Moses' choice and proving that race never determined righteousness in his eyes. Fact number 3. Jesus' cross was carried by a black man. When Jesus was too weak to carry his cross, the Roman soldiers forced a man named Simon of Cyrene to bear the load. Mark 15:21. Cyrene was a city in North Africa, modern-day Libya, which means Simon was most likely a black man. This tells us that Africans played a direct role in the sacrifice that saved all of humanity. Fact number 4. The Queen of Sheba was a black ruler. The Bible describes the Queen of Sheba as a wise and wealthy woman who traveled to test Solomon's wisdom. 1 Kings 10. Many historians and biblical scholars believe she ruled over Ethiopia or a neighboring African kingdom. Her story proves that black royalty existed and was recognized even in biblical times. Fact number 5. One of the first converts to Christianity was an African. In Acts 8, we meet the Ethiopian eunuch, a high-ranking official who served under the Queen of Ethiopia. He was reading the book of Isaiah when Philip explained the gospel to him, and he was immediately baptized. This means that Africa was one of the first places to receive the gospel, long before it spread to Europe. Fact number 6. The early church had African leaders. In Acts 13:1, we see a man named Simeon called Niger, which means black. He was one of the prophets and teachers in the early Christian church. This proves that black people were not just part of biblical history, they were leaders in the faith. Fact number 7. The Bible describes Jesus with features of a black man. Revelation 1:14-15 describes Jesus with hair like wool and feet like polished bronze. Many scholars believe this description aligns with African features. While this doesn't mean Jesus was exclusively black, it challenges the European depictions we often see and reminds us that Jesus came for all people. Final thoughts. Reclaiming our biblical identity. For too long, history has been rewritten to erase the presence of black people in the Bible. But today, we reclaim our heritage, our legacy, and our divine purpose. The Bible is a book for all people, and its truth belongs to us all. So let's stand in confidence, knowing that our roots run deep in the Word of God. The presence of black people in the Bible is evident through various names, locations, genealogies, and historical records that trace the involvement of African-descended individuals in biblical narratives. Many of these figures played significant roles in shaping the spiritual and historical framework of the Bible, yet their identities have often been overlooked or misrepresented. The first mention of black people in the Bible can be traced to the descendants of Noah's son Ham, who had 4 sons, Cush, Mizraim, Phut, and Canaan. The name Cush refers to the region that corresponds to modern-day Ethiopia and Sudan, while Mizraim is associated with Egypt. Phut is linked to Libya, and Canaan represents the land later occupied by the Israelites. This genealogical record establishes that African nations were present from the earliest biblical times. The land of Cush is mentioned repeatedly in the Old Testament as a powerful and significant kingdom. In Genesis 2:13, the Bible describes the river Gihon, which flowed through the land of Cush, making it one of the earliest geographical locations identified in the biblical account of creation. The Cushites were known for their military prowess, wisdom, and influence, with rulers who had direct interactions with biblical figures. One of the most prominent Cushite rulers was the Queen of Sheba, who traveled to meet King Solomon and test his wisdom. Historical and biblical records suggest that the Queen of Sheba ruled over a kingdom in Ethiopia or southern Arabia and was deeply revered for her intelligence, wealth, and leadership. Her visit to Solomon, as described in 1 Kings 10 and 2 Chronicles 9, highlights the connection between Africa and Israel and signifies the exchange of knowledge, culture, and spiritual understanding. Another notable black figure in the Bible is Ebed-Melech, an Ethiopian official who served in the court of King Zedekiah of Judah. In Jeremiah 38, when the prophet Jeremiah was thrown into a cistern and left to die, it was Ebed-Melech who courageously intervened and persuaded the king to rescue him. This act of bravery demonstrated the righteousness and moral strength of black individuals in biblical history. The Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8 is another key figure, representing one of the earliest known African converts to Christianity. He was a high-ranking official under the Queen of Ethiopia, and while traveling, he was reading from the book of Isaiah. Philip, one of Jesus' disciples, explained the passage to him, and the eunuch was immediately baptized, marking a significant moment in the spread of Christianity to Africa. Simon of Cyrene, mentioned in Mark 15:21, was another African present during a crucial moment in biblical history. He was compelled by Roman soldiers to carry the cross of Jesus on the way to his crucifixion. Cyrene was a region in North Africa, corresponding to modern-day Libya, indicating that Simon was likely of African descent. His role in assisting Jesus during his suffering has been commemorated throughout Christian tradition. The early Christian church also included prominent black leaders. In Acts 13:1, Simeon, called Niger, was among the prophets and teachers in Antioch. The term, Niger, means black, suggesting his African heritage. This illustrates that black people were actively involved in the establishment and leadership of the Christian faith from its earliest days. The land of Egypt, frequently mentioned throughout the Bible, was a major center of civilization and home to many interactions between biblical figures. Abraham and Sarah spent time in Egypt, Joseph rose to power there, and Moses was raised in Pharaoh's household. Given the location and historical demographics of Egypt, it is likely that many of the people encountered in these stories were of African descent. Moses himself married a Cushite woman, as recorded in Numbers 12:1. This union was significant enough to cause controversy, as his sister Miriam and brother Aaron criticized him for marrying an Ethiopian woman. However, God defended Moses and his wife, reaffirming that righteousness is not determined by race or ethnicity. The book of Isaiah contains several prophecies concerning Cush, describing it as a land of people, tall and smooth-skinned, Isaiah 18:2. The presence of Cushites in biblical prophecy and history underscores their importance in the biblical narrative. King Tirhaka of Cush, mentioned in 2 Kings 19:9 and Isaiah 37:9, was an African ruler who played a role in resisting the Assyrian invasion. The influence of black people in the Bible is also reflected in historical and archaeological findings. Ancient depictions of Egyptians, Cushites, and other African groups confirm their presence in biblical lands. Additionally, the linguistic and cultural exchanges between African and Near Eastern civilizations indicate deep connections that shaped biblical history. Many of the early church fathers, such as Augustine of Hippo, were of African descent and contributed significantly to Christian theology. Their writings and teachings influenced Christian thought for centuries, further demonstrating the lasting impact of African individuals in the biblical and early Christian eras. Throughout the Bible, Africa is frequently mentioned as a land of refuge, prosperity, and divine intervention. When Jesus was a child, his family fled to Egypt to escape King Herod's massacre, Matthew 2:13-15, showing that Africa was a place of safety even for the Son of God. This event further solidifies the integral role of African nations and people in biblical history. The presence of black people in the Bible is undeniable, spanning from the earliest genealogies in Genesis to the leadership roles in the early Christian church. Their contributions, wisdom, and faith played an essential role in shaping biblical history, yet these truths have often been overlooked or minimized. By acknowledging and understanding the significance of black people in the Bible, we gain a deeper appreciation of the rich diversity and inclusivity of God's plan for humanity. Misconceptions about biblical race and identity have persisted for centuries, largely due to cultural biases, historical misinterpretations, and the influence of European-centered depictions of biblical figures. Many people assume that the Bible exclusively features individuals of Middle Eastern or European descent, but a closer examination of scripture, historical geography, and ancient civilizations reveals a far more diverse and inclusive narrative. One of the most common misconceptions is the belief that race, as understood in modern terms, played a defining role in biblical times. The Bible does not categorize people based on race in the way that contemporary societies do. Instead, it identifies individuals and groups by their lineage, nation, or tribe, such as the Israelites, Moabites, Cushites, Egyptians, and Canaanites. This means that biblical identities were based more on cultural and familial connections than on skin color. However, because many Western artistic representations of biblical figures have traditionally depicted them as white, the misconception has developed that figures like Jesus, Moses, and the apostles were of European descent. In reality, they were from the ancient Near East, meaning they likely had olive to darker skin tones, similar to modern Middle Eastern and North African populations. Another major misconception is that Africa is largely absent from the Bible. In truth, Africa is frequently mentioned, often playing a crucial role in biblical narratives. Ancient African nations such as Egypt, Kush, modern Sudan, Ethiopia, and Libya are referenced numerous times, and many prominent biblical figures were either African or had direct connections to African civilizations. The descendants of Ham, Cush, Mizraim, Egypt, Phut, Libya, and Canaan were among the earliest groups mentioned in Genesis, proving that African heritage was present from the very beginning of human civilization. There is also a widespread misunderstanding regarding the racial identity of key biblical figures. For example, the Queen of Sheba, who visited King Solomon, is often portrayed as a Middle Eastern figure, yet historical and biblical evidence suggests she ruled over an African kingdom, likely Ethiopia or Yemen. Likewise, Moses' wife, identified as a Cushite in Numbers 12:1, is sometimes incorrectly assumed to have been of lighter complexion, despite Cush being an ancient African kingdom known for its dark-skinned inhabitants. Another prevalent misconception involves the curse of Ham, often misinterpreted as the curse of blackness. Some historical narratives falsely claim that Noah cursed his son Ham with dark skin and servitude, using this distortion to justify slavery and racial discrimination. However, the actual biblical text in Genesis 9:25 states that Noah cursed Canaan, not Ham, and there is no mention of skin color in the passage. This misinterpretation has been widely debunked, yet its effects on racial attitudes and biases have been long-lasting. Similarly, many assume that early Christianity was primarily a European movement, ignoring the fact that Africa was one of the first regions to embrace Christianity. The Ethiopian eunuch, a high-ranking official in the court of the Queen of Ethiopia, was among the first recorded Gentile converts to Christianity in Acts 8. Additionally, some of the earliest Christian theologians and church fathers, such as Augustine of Hippo, Tertullian, and Origen, were of African descent and contributed significantly to the foundation of Christian doctrine. Another misunderstanding concerns the racial diversity within biblical Israel itself. The ancient Israelites, located at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe, likely had a wide range of physical appearances. Because of intermarriage and trade, the Israelites would have included individuals with African, Semitic, and possibly even European features. The Bible frequently mentions interactions between Israelites and Cushites, Egyptians, and other neighboring peoples, further demonstrating that biblical societies were racially and ethnically diverse. The portrayal of Jesus in Western art has also contributed to misconceptions about biblical identity. European Renaissance painters often depicted Jesus with pale skin, light brown or blonde hair, and blue eyes, which does not align with historical or scriptural evidence. As a Jewish man born in the region of Judea, Jesus would have had features common to Middle Eastern populations of the time, likely with darker skin, dark hair, and brown eyes. The description of Jesus in Revelation 1:14-15, which mentions his hair being like wool and his feet resembling burnished bronze, has led some to argue that he may have had features more commonly associated with people of African descent. However, this passage is largely symbolic rather than a literal description of his earthly appearance. Another major misconception is the assumption that the early church had little to no African involvement. In reality, Africa played a vital role in the development of Christianity. The city of Alexandria in Egypt was one of the most important centers of Christian learning in the early centuries, producing scholars such as Athanasius and Clement of Alexandria. North Africa was also home to significant Christian communities long before Christianity spread widely in Europe. Additionally, biblical figures like Simon of Cyrene, who helped carry Jesus' cross, and Simeon called Niger, who was one of the prophets and teachers in Antioch, suggest that African individuals were actively involved in the early Christian movement. Another false belief is that black people were absent from biblical prophecies and divine plans. However, Isaiah 18 describes Cush as a land whose people would bring gifts to God. And Zephaniah 3:10 speaks of the people from beyond the rivers of Cush bringing offerings to the Lord. These references indicate that Africa and its inhabitants were always included in God's redemptive plan. Misconceptions about biblical race and identity have also been perpetuated by colonial narratives that sought to downplay the contributions of non-European civilizations to biblical history. For centuries, European scholars and theologians often dismissed the role of African nations in the Bible, reinforcing the idea that biblical history was primarily a European narrative. This deliberate erasure has led many to overlook the deep connections between biblical events and African civilizations. Another widespread myth is the idea that Jewish identity in biblical times was monolithic. In reality, Jewish communities existed in Africa, Arabia, and other parts of the ancient world, leading to a variety of ethnic backgrounds within Judaism. Even today, Ethiopian Jews Beta Israel trace their lineage back to biblical times, further demonstrating the historical diversity of the Jewish people. The misconception that black people were largely absent from biblical history has led many to feel disconnected from their spiritual heritage. However, when biblical texts are examined without cultural bias, it becomes clear that black individuals and African nations played crucial roles in God's plan throughout history. Many of the early Christian martyrs, scholars, and leaders were of African descent, further proving that black people were never outsiders in the biblical narrative. Some interpretations have also wrongly suggested that biblical figures who were black were secondary or insignificant. In truth, many of these individuals were rulers, warriors, prophets, and influential figures in shaping biblical events. From the powerful kingdom of Cush to the leadership roles in the early church, African-descended people have been integral to the biblical story. Another damaging misconception is the belief that Africa only appears in the Bible in negative contexts, such as slavery or plagues. While Egypt, for example, is often remembered for enslaving the Israelites, it was also a place of refuge for biblical figures like Abraham, Joseph, and even Jesus. Additionally, Africa is frequently mentioned as a place of wealth, wisdom, and divine intervention. The notion that biblical identity is tied strictly to European ancestry has been widely challenged by modern scholarship, which continues to reveal the true diversity of biblical times. The Bible presents a global narrative that includes people of all races and backgrounds, making it clear that no single ethnic group can claim exclusive ownership of its message. The presence of black people in the Bible is not a recent discovery, but rather a long overlooked truth that deserves recognition. The diversity of biblical characters reflects God's intention for all nations to be part of His kingdom, breaking down racial and ethnic barriers that have been falsely constructed over time. By understanding the historical reality of race and identity in biblical times, people can appreciate the inclusivity and richness of the biblical story in its true context.